The candles in the ballroom trembled as the doors slammed open, and every head turned toward the Duke of Ashbourne. He walked in like a storm given shape, his boots striking the marble floor in sharp, deliberate beats, and the music died before the violinist even realized his bow had stopped moving. Cassandra Whitmore felt her stomach drop before she even understood why. She had come to this ball hoping to disappear into the shadows near the tall windows, as she always did, but the Duke's eyes found her instantly, as though he had been searching for her the moment he arrived. He crossed the room without a single word of greeting to his hosts, without a bow to the elderly ladies who gasped and clutched their fans, without the smallest courtesy that his rank demanded. He stopped less than 3 feet from Cassandra, so close she could see the fury simmering beneath his composed face, and he spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Your father owes me £11,000, Miss Whitmore. He has ignored 3 letters and 2 visits from my solicitor. I have come to collect what is owed, and since your father is too much of a coward to face me himself, I will have satisfaction from his daughter instead." "Kneel." The word landed like a slap. Cassandra heard someone behind her draw in a sharp breath. She saw Lady Beatrice Fenwick's mouth curl into a delighted little smile, the kind she wore whenever misfortune visited someone else. Cassandra's own heartbeat roared in her ears, but she did not move, did not flinch, did not look away from the Duke's cold gray eyes. "I will not," she said. A ripple went through the crowd. Nobody refused the Duke of Ashbourne. Nobody dared to embarrass him, least of all a woman whose family teetered on the edge of ruin. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Cassandra thought he might actually reach for her, might actually try to force her down in front of 300 witnesses. Instead, he leaned closer, close enough that only she could hear him. "You have no idea what your father has done," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what is coming for your family. I suggest you reconsider your pride before it costs you everything." "My pride is the only thing my family has left," Cassandra answered. "You may take the rest, if you can find it, but you will not take that." The Duke straightened, studying her as though seeing her for the first time, not as an extension of her father's debts but as a person entirely separate from them. Something shifted in his expression, though Cassandra could not name what it was. Anger, certainly, but underneath it, something closer to surprise. "Very well," he said, loud enough again for the room to hear. "Since Miss Whitmore refuses to settle her family's debt with the respect it deserves, I will be calling upon her father tomorrow morning. He will not enjoy the conversation." He turned on his heel and left as abruptly as he had arrived, and the moment the doors shut behind him, the ballroom exploded into whispers. Cassandra stood alone in the center of it all, feeling every eye in the room dissect her, judge her, delight in her disgrace. Lady Beatrice glided toward her with practiced sympathy stretched across her face like a mask. "How brave of you," Beatrice said, not bothering to hide the mockery underneath her words. "Or how foolish. I do wonder which it will prove to be." Cassandra did not answer. She gathered what remained of her composure and walked toward the door, refusing to run, refusing to let a single tear fall until she was safely inside her family's carriage. Only then, in the darkness, with the city passing by in blurred lantern light, did she allow herself to shake. Her home was smaller than it used to be. 2 years ago, her family had occupied a grand townhouse near the finest square in the city. Now they rented 4 rooms above a dressmaker's shop, and even those rooms cost more than her father could reliably pay. Cassandra let herself in quietly, hoping to reach her bedroom without waking anyone, but she found her father, Lord Edmund Whitmore, sitting awake by a dying fire, a glass of brandy trembling slightly in his hand. "You are home early," he said, not looking at her. "The Duke of Ashbourne came to the ball," Cassandra said. "He announced our debt in front of everyone. He ordered me to kneel." Her father's face went the color of ash. He set down his glass with a shaking hand. He would not dare. "He did dare, father. He said he is calling on you tomorrow morning, and that you will not enjoy the conversation." Lord Whitmore pressed his palms against his eyes, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Cassandra watched him, waiting for an explanation, waiting for some reassurance that the debt was smaller than the Duke claimed, that there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be sorted out with a calm conversation and a modest payment plan. Instead, her father simply looked older than she had ever seen him, older than his years, weighed down by something he had clearly been hiding for a long time. "It is worse than £11,000, he finally admitted. "There are other debts. Older ones. I borrowed against the estate before it was sold. I borrowed against your dowry, Cassandra. I borrowed against your sister's dowry as well. I have been trying to find a way out of this for 2 years, and every path I take leads to a deeper hole." Cassandra felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her sister, Louisa, was only 17, still dreaming of her first proper season, still innocent of how precarious their situation truly was. If there was no dowry, there would be no good marriage for her either. Everything Cassandra had tried to protect by refusing to kneel in that ballroom suddenly felt smaller, more fragile, more urgently in danger than she had realized even an hour ago. "What did the Duke say exactly?" her father asked. "Word for word, if you can remember it." Cassandra repeated the conversation as precisely as she could, watching her father's face crumple further with every sentence. When she reached the part where the Duke leaned close and warned her that she had no idea what was coming for her family, her father let out a low, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "He knows," her father whispered. "He must know everything." "Know what, father?" But Lord Whitmore only shook his head and reached for his brandy again, his hand no longer trembling, but moving with the practiced numbness of a man who had given up trying to fight whatever was coming. Cassandra realized, with a cold certainty settling into her chest, that she would get no more answers from him tonight. Whatever secret he was hiding, he intended to carry it alone for as long as he possibly could. She did not sleep. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the street below, carriages rattling over cobblestones, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, and she turned the evening over and over in her mind. The Duke's fury had not seemed like the fury of a man simply owed money. There had been something personal in it, something that went beyond £11,000 and a string of ignored letters. He had looked at her as though she were somehow responsible, as though her refusal to kneel had confirmed some suspicion he already carried about her family. Morning came too quickly. Cassandra dressed carefully, choosing her plainest gown, the one without a single tear or faded seam, determined to face whatever was coming with dignity, even if she could not face it with wealth. She was in the small sitting room, trying to distract Louisa with a book neither of them was truly reading, when the knock came at the door. The Duke of Ashbourne stood on their threshold, dressed in dark traveling clothes, his expression unreadable. He did not wait to be invited inside. He simply stepped past the maid who answered the door and walked directly into the sitting room, his eyes sweeping over the modest furniture, the faded curtains, the unmistakable signs of a family clinging to appearances they could no longer afford. "Lord Whitmore," he said, "I trust your daughter informed you of our conversation last night." Cassandra's father rose slowly from his chair, his face pale but composed now, as though he had spent the night preparing himself for this exact moment. "She did, Your Grace. I must apologize for her behavior. She is young, and she does not fully understand the gravity of our situation." "On the contrary," the Duke said, his gaze flicking briefly toward Cassandra, "I believe she understands it perfectly well. Better than you have allowed her to, it seems." Louisa looked between her sister and her father, clearly confused, clearly frightened by the tension crackling in the small room. Cassandra reached for her sister's hand, holding it steady even though her own pulse was racing. "Your Grace, if we might discuss this privately," her father began, but the Duke shook his head sharply. "There will be no private discussions, Lord Whitmore. I have been more than patient. I have sent letters. I have sent my solicitor. I have waited nearly 2 years for you to make even a partial payment, and instead you have borrowed further, against properties that were never fully yours to mortgage, against dowries that belong to your daughters and not to you. I know everything, Lord Whitmore. I have known for months. I simply wanted to see how long you would let your daughters suffer for your mistakes before you finally told them the truth." The room fell utterly silent. Cassandra felt Louisa's hand tighten around hers, felt her own breath catch somewhere in her throat. Her father opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to summon a single word in his own defense. "There is a way to resolve this," the Duke continued, his voice cooling into something more businesslike, though no less commanding. "A way that does not involve the courts, does not involve public ruin, does not involve your daughters losing every possibility of a respectable future, but it requires your full honesty, starting now, and it requires your eldest daughter's cooperation." We looked directly at Cassandra then, and something in his gaze had changed since the night before. The fury was still there, banked beneath the surface, but there was something else mixed into it now, something calculating and deliberate. "What is it you want from me?" Cassandra asked, lifting her chin, refusing to let her voice shake even though her whole body felt as though it might. "Marriage," the Duke said simply. "You will marry me, Miss Whitmore, and in exchange, I will absorb your father's debts entirely. Every last shilling of them. Your sister will have her dowry restored. Your family will keep this house, or a better one, and no one outside these walls will ever know the true extent of what your father has done." Louisa gasped audibly. Lord Whitmore sank back into his chair as though his legs could no longer hold him. Cassandra simply stared at the Duke, searching his face for some sign that this was cruelty, that this was a punishment disguised as a solution, but she found nothing there except cold, unshakable resolve. "And if I refuse?" she asked. "Then your father will be arrested within the week. Your family's remaining possessions will be seized, and you and your sister will discover exactly how unforgiving this city can be to women with nothing left to their name." The threat hung in the air, absolute and unyielding. Cassandra thought of Louisa's dreams of a first season, of her father's trembling hands, of the modest dignity they had all fought so hard to preserve even as everything else crumbled around them. She thought of the ballroom the night before, of every eye watching her, waiting to see whether she would break. She had refused to kneel once already. She was not about to let this man believe he had won simply because he had found a new way to bring her to her knees. "I will marry you," she said, "but not on your terms alone. If I am to save my family, I will do it as your equal, not as a debt you have decided to collect. I want conditions of my own, Your Grace, and I want them in writing before I agree to anything." For the first time since he had walked through the door, something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across the Duke's face. He inclined his head slightly, studying her the way a man might study an opponent who had just made an unexpectedly clever move on a chessboard. "Very well, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Name your conditions. I am listening." Outside, the morning light was breaking fully over the city, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to toll the hour, as though marking the exact moment Cassandra's entire life turned onto a path she had never chosen, and could no longer refuse to walk. Cassandra did not hesitate once the Duke gave her permission to speak. She had spent the entire night turning over every possible outcome of this conversation, and now that the moment had arrived, she refused to waste it stumbling over her own fear. "First," she said, "the settlement of my father's debts must be recorded in writing, witnessed by a solicitor of my choosing, not yours. I will not risk a verbal promise that can be denied later." "Agreed," the Duke said, without a flicker of hesitation. "Second, my sister's dowry must be restored in full, and placed in a trust that neither you nor my father can touch. It belongs to her, and to her alone, regardless of what happens between us." "Agreed." "Third," Cassandra continued, her voice growing steadier with each condition she named, "I will not be a decoration in your household. I want control over my own allowance, the freedom to visit my family whenever I choose, and a voice in matters that concern the running of your estate. I have watched my father destroy everything through secrecy and pride. I will not repeat his mistakes by staying silent in my own marriage." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Cassandra forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to look away first. Behind her, she heard her father shift uncomfortably in his chair, clearly startled by the boldness of his daughter's demands, but he said nothing to stop her. "You ask for a great deal, Miss Whitmore," the Duke finally said. "You are asking a great deal of me in return, Your Grace. A lifetime, in exchange for a debt that was never mine to begin with. I think my conditions are more than fair." Something almost like amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Very well. I will have the settlement drawn up within the week. My solicitor will meet with yours to finalize the terms. The wedding will take place 1 month from now." "1 month," Lord Whitmore repeated weakly. "Your Grace, surely there is no need for such haste." "There is every need," the Duke said, his tone hardening again. "The longer this arrangement remains unofficial, the more opportunity there is for gossip to spread and for creditors to grow impatient. A quick, decisive wedding will silence most of the questions before they have time to multiply." He turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked back at Cassandra one final time. "I will send my carriage tomorrow afternoon, so that you may begin discussing arrangements with my aunt, Lady Margaret. She will assist with the wedding preparations. I suggest you rest, Miss Whitmore. You will need your strength for what is coming." The door closed behind him, and for a long moment, no one in the small sitting room moved. Louisa was the first to break the silence, throwing her arms around Cassandra's neck, half sobbing with relief and confusion at once. "You saved us," she whispered. "Cassandra, you saved all of us." Cassandra held her sister close, but her mind was already racing ahead, past the relief, past the fear, toward the enormous unknown stretching out before her. She was going to marry a man who, only hours ago, had ordered her to kneel in front of half the city. She did not know him, did not trust him, and could not begin to guess what kind of husband he would become once the wedding was finished and the debt was settled, and there was no longer any reason for him to treat her with even the smallest measure of restraint. Her father remained silent for the rest of the day, retreating to his study and not emerging even for supper. Cassandra understood, in a distant sort of way, that he was ashamed, that the weight of what he had done to his daughters was finally settling on him fully, now that someone else had been forced to pay the price of undoing it. She found she could not summon much sympathy for him. Her thoughts were consumed instead by the month ahead, by the strange new life waiting for her at the end of it. The following afternoon, exactly as promised, the Duke's carriage arrived, gleaming black with a crest Cassandra did not recognize painted in gold along the door. She was taken to Ashbourne House, a residence so grand it made her family's rented rooms feel like a servant's quarters by comparison. Lady Margaret, the Duke's aunt, greeted her in the entrance hall with a measured, appraising look that reminded Cassandra uncomfortably of a merchant assessing goods before purchase. "So you are the young woman who refused to kneel," Lady Margaret said, not unkindly, though there was no warmth in it either. "My nephew has told me almost nothing about you, which I confess intrigues me more than if he had told me everything. I hope I will not disappoint you, my lady. You already surprise me, which is rarer and more valuable. Come, there is a great deal to discuss, and very little time in which to discuss it." For the following weeks, Cassandra's days filled with fittings, meetings with solicitors, long lists of guests to invite and decisions to approve. She threw herself into the preparations partly out of necessity and partly because it gave her something to focus on besides the growing unease she felt whenever she thought too closely about the man she would soon call her husband. She saw the Duke only rarely during this time, brief encounters in hallways or across dinner tables where his aunt insisted on maintaining some appearance of courtship, however hollow it truly was. During one such dinner, nearly 2 weeks before the wedding, Cassandra found herself seated beside him while Lady Margaret entertained other guests further down the table. The Duke had said little all evening, and Cassandra, emboldened by wine and frustration, finally turned to him directly. "You still have not told me why," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "You could have simply demanded payment, taken my father to court, ruined us through the proper legal channels. Instead, you chose marriage. I would like to understand why." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning his wineglass slowly between his fingers. "Because ruining your father would not have solved the actual problem," he finally said. "And because I do not believe in wasting something valuable simply because it arrived to me in an inconvenient package. Is that meant to be a compliment? It is meant to be honest. I find I have very little patience left for anything else." Cassandra studied him, searching for the cruelty she had witnessed in the ballroom, the cold command in his voice when he had first spoken to her, but found instead something more complicated, something guarded and tired in a way she had not expected from a man of such wealth and power. She did not trust it fully, not yet, but she filed the observation away nonetheless. A week into the preparations, Cassandra insisted on meeting personally with the solicitor her father had once used for family matters, a careful, soft-spoken man named Edward Pratt. She wanted to read every line of the settlement herself, not simply trust that the Duke's promises would be honored once the ceremony was finished and the eyes of the city had moved on to some other scandal. "Everything appears in order, Miss Whitmore," Mr. Pratt told her, adjusting his spectacles as he traced a finger down the final page of the document. "The Duke's solicitor has been remarkably thorough. Your sister's trust is airtight, protected from any future claim by your father, or indeed, by the Duke himself. Your personal allowance is generous and larger than I expected, given the circumstances." "He agreed to everything without argument," Cassandra said, half to herself. "I keep waiting to find the flaw hidden somewhere in the details." Mr. Pratt glanced up at her, his expression thoughtful. "In my experience, Miss Whitmore, men who intend to deceive rarely allow a stranger's solicitor to examine their promises this closely. Whatever else may be true of the Duke of Ashbourne, I do not believe he intends to break this particular agreement. Whether that tells you anything about his character beyond the paper itself, I cannot say." Cassandra folded the settlement carefully and tucked it into her bag, carrying it home that evening as though it were a shield rather than a contract. She read it again that night by candlelight, memorizing every clause, until she felt, for the first time since the ballroom, that she was standing on solid ground rather than simply falling toward an uncertain future. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the city, exactly as the Duke had predicted, and not all of it was kind. Cassandra began to hear the whispers wherever she went, in shops, in church, in the brief moments between fittings when she passed groups of women who fell suddenly and pointedly silent as she approached. They called her a debt bride behind gloved hands, a woman who had sold herself to save her father's failing fortunes, a fortune hunter dressed up in the language of family duty. She held her chin high through all of it, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing how deeply the words cut. Lady Beatrice Fenwick, predictably, proved the most relentless source of the gossip. She appeared at nearly every gathering Cassandra attended in the weeks leading up to the wedding, always positioned close enough to be overheard, always speaking in tones dripping with false sympathy. "Poor Cassandra," she said one afternoon at a garden party, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear, forced to marry a man who publicly humiliated her, simply because her father could not manage his own accounts. "I do wonder what the Duke truly thinks of her, beneath all that polite arrangement. A man does not forget being defied in front of the entire city, whatever settlement papers might say." Cassandra turned to face her directly, refusing to let the comment pass unanswered. "I would rather be defied against and respected for it than admired for saying nothing at all, Lady Beatrice. But I imagine that distinction is difficult for you to understand." A few of the nearby guests laughed, quickly stifled, and Beatrice's smile thinned into something sharper. "We shall see how well your courage serves you once the wedding is finished, and the Duke no longer has any reason to be gentle with you." The words lingered with Cassandra long after the party ended, echoing through her mind during the quiet moments when the busy preparations gave way to silence. She did not know the Duke well enough to say whether Beatrice's warning held any truth, and that uncertainty frightened her more than any open cruelty could have. 3 days before the wedding, Cassandra received an unexpected visit from Lady Margaret at her family's rented rooms. The older woman arrived alone, without the usual entourage of seamstresses and assistants, and asked to speak with Cassandra privately. "I want to tell you something about my nephew," Lady Margaret said once they were alone, though he would likely be furious with me for sharing it. "He was not always the man you saw in that ballroom. He became that man after his father, the late Duke, nearly destroyed this family through the same kind of reckless borrowing your own father engaged in. My nephew watched everything he loved nearly slip away because of one man's pride and secrecy. When he looks at debt now, Cassandra, he does not simply see numbers. He sees the possibility of losing everything all over again." Cassandra absorbed this slowly, feeling something shift inside her, some small crack forming in the wall of resentment she had built around herself since the night of the ball. "That does not excuse how he treated me." "No," Lady Margaret agreed. "It does not. But it may help you understand him, which is a different and perhaps more useful thing than forgiveness. My nephew does not trust easily, and he punishes what he fears most severely. I believe, in his own difficult way, he is trying to protect something by controlling it before it can hurt him first. And what does he fear from me?" Lady Margaret's expression softened into something almost like pity. "I suspect he fears exactly what he found in you the night he demanded you kneel, someone who would not simply bend to his will, someone he cannot fully predict or control. That is a rare and frightening thing for a man like my nephew, Cassandra, rarer than you might imagine." The words stayed with Cassandra through the final days before the wedding, mixing uneasily with the whispers of the ton, the sharp edges of Beatrice's warnings, the strange, complicated tenderness she had glimpsed briefly in the Duke's eyes during their dinner conversation. She did not know, standing at the edge of this new life, whether she was walking toward safety or toward an entirely different kind of danger. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would not face it kneeling. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cool, with a fine mist settling over the city as though the sky itself could not decide whether to weep or simply wait and watch. Cassandra stood before the mirror in her wedding gown, staring at the reflection of a woman who looked, for the first time in months, almost like a stranger to herself. Calm, composed, ready, or as ready as she would ever be, to walk into a marriage built on debt and defiance in equal measure. Louisa fastened the final clasp at the back of her gown, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you frightened?" she asked softly. Cassandra met her own gaze in the mirror, thinking of the ballroom, of the word kneel hanging in the air like a blade, of everything she had refused to surrender since that night. "A little," she admitted, "but I did not survive this far by letting fear decide anything for me. I do not intend to start now." The cathedral bells had barely finished ringing when the first sign of trouble appeared. Cassandra stood at the entrance of the church, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm, watching the assembled guests turn in their pews to look at her. She had expected curiosity. She had expected judgment. What she had not expected was the strange, electric tension that seemed to hum through the crowd, as though everyone present already knew something she did not. She found the source of it the moment she reached the front of the church and caught sight of Lady Beatrice Fenwick seated in the third row, a folded piece of paper visible just at the edge of her glove, clutched with obvious anticipation. Cassandra's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep walking, to keep her expression calm, refusing to let anyone see the flicker of dread crossing through her. The Duke waited for her at the altar, dressed in dark formal clothes that made him look even more severe than usual, his expression unreadable as she approached. For a brief moment, as their eyes met, Cassandra thought she saw something almost like reassurance pass between them, though she could not be certain whether she had imagined it out of desperate hope or whether it had truly been there. The ceremony began smoothly enough. The bishop spoke the familiar words, the guests sat in respectful silence, and Cassandra allowed herself, for just a moment, to believe that perhaps the day would pass without incident after all. Then, just as the bishop asked if anyone present knew of any reason the marriage should not proceed, Lady Beatrice rose from her seat. "I do," she announced, her voice ringing clearly through the cathedral. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but I believe the assembled guests deserve to know the truth about this union before it is made permanent." A wave of gasps rippled through the pews. Cassandra felt her father stiffen beside her, felt the Duke go rigid at the altar, though his face remained carefully composed. Beatrice unfolded the paper in her hand and held it aloft, walking a few steps into the aisle so that everyone could see it clearly. This letter was written by Miss Whitmore herself, only 3 weeks ago, to a dear friend of mine. In it, she confesses that she deliberately provoked the Duke at the ball, knowing full well it would force his hand toward marriage, because her family desperately needed his fortune to survive. She admits, in her own words, to manipulating this entire situation for her own gain. The cathedral erupted into whispers. Cassandra felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the weight of 300 assumptions crashing down at once, and for a single terrifying moment, she did not know how to respond. She had written no such letter. She had confessed nothing of the sort to anyone. But the paper looked convincing from where she stood, her own handwriting rendered with unsettling accuracy across its surface. She stepped forward before her fear could root her in place, extending her hand toward Beatrice with as much calm as she could summon. "May I see it?" Beatrice hesitated, clearly not expecting the request, but with the entire congregation watching, she could hardly refuse without appearing to have something to hide herself. She handed over the letter with a triumphant little smile, clearly certain that Cassandra's composure would crumble the moment she examined the damning words for herself. Cassandra scanned the page quickly, her mind racing even as her expression remained carefully neutral. The handwriting was a passable imitation of her own, but not perfect, not to someone who had written thousands of letters in her own hand over the years. The looped tail on her lowercase g's curled the wrong direction. The crossing of her t's sat too high above the letter itself. And most damning of all, the letter was dated 3 weeks earlier, on a day Cassandra remembered with absolute clarity, because it was the day she had spent entirely at Ashbourne House with Lady Margaret, reviewing guest lists from morning until well past dark. She turned to face the congregation, holding the letter up so that those nearest could see it clearly, and let her voice carry with steady, deliberate confidence. "This letter is a forgery," she said. "I can prove it in 3 separate ways, and I invite anyone who doubts me to examine the evidence themselves. First, the handwriting, while a reasonable imitation, differs from my own in several distinct details, which any of my former tutors or correspondents could confirm upon inspection. Second, the letter is dated the 14th of last month, a day I spent entirely in the company of Lady Margaret, reviewing wedding arrangements at Ashbourne House from morning until evening, as she herself can attest. And third, and perhaps most simply, I have never in my life corresponded with the friend Lady Beatrice claims received this letter, a fact that friend herself can confirm, should she care to step forward and answer questions honestly rather than remain conveniently absent from these proceedings." A murmur of agreement rose from several corners of the church. Lady Margaret rose from her seat near the front, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "I can confirm every word Miss Whitmore has just said. She was with me the entire day in question. I have witnesses among my own staff who can attest to the same, should the bishop require further proof." Beatrice's confident expression began to falter, color rising in her cheeks as the crowd's sympathy visibly shifted beneath her. She reached for the letter, attempting to reclaim it, but Cassandra held it firmly out of reach. "I think," Cassandra said, turning back to face Beatrice directly, "the more interesting question is not whether this letter is genuine, which we have now established quite thoroughly that it is not, but rather who forged it, and why Lady Beatrice was so eager to present it as truth without pausing to verify a single detail first. That seems to me like the behavior of someone who wanted very badly to believe an accusation, regardless of whether it was actually true." The congregation's whispers shifted tone entirely now, curiosity turning toward suspicion, sympathy turning away from Beatrice and toward the composed young woman standing at the altar with quiet, unshakable dignity. Beatrice opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to summon a defense that would not further damage her own standing. The Duke, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally stepped forward, positioning himself beside Cassandra with unmistakable purpose. "I believe Miss Whitmore has answered the question thoroughly and honestly," he said, his voice carrying easily across the cathedral. "I have reviewed her handwriting myself, in the settlement documents we exchanged over the past month, and I can confirm that this letter matches none of the samples I have seen. Lady Beatrice, I would strongly advise you to reconsider making further accusations against my future wife, unless you are prepared to answer for the consequences of spreading deliberate falsehoods in a house of worship." Beatrice's face went pale, then flushed with humiliation as she realized the full weight of her miscalculation settling over her. Without another word, she turned and made her way toward the cathedral doors, her earlier triumph collapsing into hurried, undignified retreat. The doors closed behind her with a heavy, final sound, and for a moment, the entire congregation sat in stunned silence. The bishop, visibly relieved to return to familiar territory, cleared his throat and asked once more if there existed any legitimate reason the marriage should not proceed. When no one answered, he continued the ceremony as though the interruption had never occurred, though Cassandra could feel the shift in the room around her, the curiosity that had once carried an edge of judgment now carrying something closer to respect. She turned to face the Duke as the final vows approached, studying his profile in the candlelight, searching for some sign of what he truly thought of everything that had just happened. He caught her gaze and held it, and for the briefest moment, something passed between them that felt entirely different from the cold negotiation of their engagement, something that felt, unexpectedly, like partnership. "You did not need my help," he said quietly, so only she could hear, as the bishop continued speaking the final words of the ceremony. "You dismantled her entirely on your own." "I did not need it," Cassandra murmured back, "but I did not mind that you offered it." When the bishop asked for the exchange of vows, Cassandra found her voice steadier than she expected, each word landing with quiet conviction, rather than the hollow recitation she had imagined weeks earlier, when the wedding was still an arrangement built entirely on debt. The Duke's own vows, when he spoke them, carried none of the coldness she remembered from the ballroom. His voice was low, deliberate, and for the first time since their engagement began, it did not sound like a man reciting an obligation. It sounded, strangely, like a man making a genuine promise, even if neither of them yet understood what that promise might eventually mean. As the rings were exchanged, Cassandra allowed herself a brief glance around the cathedral, taking in the faces that had, only minutes before, been ready to condemn her on the strength of a single forged letter. Now they watched with something closer to fascination, several of the older matrons dabbing at their eyes, as though the drama of the morning had somehow rendered the ceremony more moving rather than less. She thought of her father, seated in the front pew with an expression caught somewhere between shame and pride, and of Louisa beside him, beaming despite everything, too young yet to fully grasp how close the entire day had come to catastrophe. When the ceremony finally concluded and they were declared husband and wife, the applause that followed felt different from the polite, obligatory sound Cassandra had expected. It felt genuine, warmed by the drama that had unfolded and by her own composed handling of it, as though the congregation had witnessed something more compelling than a simple wedding, something closer to a small, satisfying victory. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ashbourne House buzzed with conversation entirely different from what Cassandra had anticipated. Instead of whispered speculation about a debt bride forced into marriage, guests approached her directly, curious and openly admiring, asking about the details of how she had so quickly identified the forgery, complimenting her composure under such public pressure. Lady Margaret found her during a quiet moment near the garden doors, her expression warmer than Cassandra had yet seen it. "I underestimated you," Lady Margaret admitted. "I confess I expected you to survive this marriage through careful compliance. I did not expect you to survive it through sheer force of will. I believe my nephew may have found something far more valuable than he initially bargained for." Across the room, Cassandra caught sight of the Duke speaking quietly with an older gentleman she did not recognize, his expression more relaxed than she had seen it since their first encounter in the ballroom. As though sensing her attention, he glanced up and met her gaze across the crowded room, and this time, unmistakably, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Cassandra did not know, as the wedding breakfast stretched into afternoon and the guests slowly began to depart, whether the strange alliance forming between herself and her new husband would grow into something lasting, or whether it would collapse the moment the immediate crisis of Beatrice's scheme faded from memory. But she knew, with growing certainty, that she had married a man capable of surprising her, and that she herself was capable of surprising him in return. For the first time since the night she had refused to kneel, That felt less like a danger to be managed and more like a possibility worth exploring. Later in the afternoon, as the wedding breakfast began to thin and guests drifted toward the gardens for air, Cassandra found herself approached by a young man she recognized vaguely from previous gatherings, a friend of the Duke's named Henry Colton, whose easy manner made him seem entirely unbothered by the formality of the occasion. "That was the finest piece of theater I have witnessed at a wedding in years," Henry said, grinning as he offered her a glass of champagne. "Beatrice Fenwick has been looking for an excuse to humiliate someone publicly for months. I confess I did not expect her target to turn the blade back on her so neatly. I would rather not have needed to," Cassandra admitted, "though I confess there was some satisfaction in it." "There ought to have been. Tell me, do you have any theory as to who actually forged the letter?" "Beatrice is clever enough to scheme, but I have never known her to be skilled with a pen. Someone else's hand shaped those words, even if her mouth delivered them." The question lingered with Cassandra long after Henry moved on to speak with other guests. She had been so focused on defending herself in the moment that she had not paused to consider the mechanics behind the forgery itself, the precision required to imitate her handwriting closely enough to fool a room full of witnesses, even briefly. Someone had studied her letters carefully. Someone had access to samples of her writing, likely obtained through the settlement correspondence exchanged over the past month between her own solicitor and the Duke's household. She found Lady Margaret near the garden doors and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether any of the Duke's household staff had handled her correspondence during the wedding preparations. "Only my nephew's steward, Mr. Pelham," Lady Margaret said, frowning slightly at the question. "He manages most of the household paperwork, including anything that passed between the solicitors. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Cassandra said, though the answer settled uneasily in her mind. "I simply wondered how closely my letters had been handled before reaching their intended recipients." Lady Margaret's frown deepened, but she did not press further, and Cassandra let the subject drop for the moment, filing the name away with the same careful attention she had given to every other detail of her new circumstances since the night in the ballroom. She did not yet know what, if anything, the observation meant, but something about the ease with which Beatrice had produced such a convincing forgery told her the scheme had not begun and ended with one jealous woman alone. That evening, as the last of the guests departed and the great house settled into quiet, the Duke found her alone in the library, staring at the shelves of books she had not yet had the chance to properly explore. "I owe you an apology," he said, startling her slightly as he stepped into the room. "For the ballroom, for the word I used. I have thought of little else since Lady Beatrice's letter, watching you defend yourself with more grace than I showed you that night." Cassandra turned to face him fully, weighing his words carefully before responding. "You do not owe me an apology tonight, Your Grace. You owe me one eventually, when you are ready to give it honestly rather than because guilt has caught up with you after a dramatic afternoon. I would rather wait for the real one." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then, unexpectedly, he nodded. "Fair enough, Cassandra. I will hold myself to that." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about hearing it in his voice, quiet and deliberate in the empty library, settled strangely and not unpleasantly in her chest. Whatever this marriage would become, she realized, it would not be the simple transaction either of them had first imagined. It was already something far more complicated, and far more interesting, than either of them had anticipated. 3 weeks into her marriage, Cassandra found herself standing in the doorway of the estate office late one evening, watching Mr. Pelham gather papers from the desk with unusual haste, as though he had not expected anyone to disturb him at that hour. He startled when he noticed her, dropping a small stack of documents that scattered across the floor between them. "Forgive me, Your Grace," he said quickly, using her new title with a stiffness that had never quite settled into ease since the wedding. "I did not hear you approach. I was simply finishing the evening accounts." Cassandra bent to help gather the fallen papers before he could stop her, and in the brief moment before he snatched them from her hands, she caught sight of a name scrawled across one of the pages, followed by a figure that did not match anything she had seen in the settlement documents her own solicitor had reviewed so carefully. She said nothing at the time, simply handed over the remaining papers and excused herself with practiced calm, but the name stayed with her long after she left the room. The following morning she sought out Mr. Pratt, her family's solicitor, requesting a private meeting away from Ashbourne House. She met him at a small tea room near the city center, choosing a table tucked away from other patrons, and laid out what little she had observed. "I want you to investigate the origins of my father's debt to the Duke," she said, "specifically the £11,000 mentioned that night in the ballroom. I want to know precisely how that figure was calculated, and by whom." Mr. Pratt raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the request. "You suspect an irregularity, Your Grace. I suspect a great many things, and I would rather have evidence than suspicion before I act on any of them." It took nearly 2 weeks for Mr. Pratt to return with answers, during which time Cassandra continued settling into the rhythms of her new household, learning the names of the staff, reviewing accounts alongside Lady Margaret, and slowly, cautiously, growing accustomed to the presence of her husband across the breakfast table each morning. Their conversations remained careful, still feeling their way toward something neither of them had a clear name for yet. But they had grown warmer than the cold negotiations of their first meetings, softened by small shared jokes and the quiet companionship of two people learning to trust each other in careful increments. One morning, the Duke surprised her by asking her opinion on a matter of estate management, a decision about whether to renew the lease of a tenant farmer whose payments had grown increasingly late over the past year. It was a small thing, hardly significant in the wider scope of running a household as large as Ashbourne, but Cassandra understood immediately what it represented. He was not simply performing the courtesy of asking. He genuinely wanted to hear what she thought, and he adjusted his own plans slightly once she suggested a longer grace period rather than immediate eviction, reasoning that a family struggling through one difficult harvest deserved more patience than punishment. "You argue for mercy rather quickly," he observed, watching her across the breakfast table with an expression she was beginning to recognize as genuine curiosity rather than simple politeness. "I argue for understanding," she corrected. "My own family nearly lost everything through circumstances that were not entirely within our control. I would rather extend the same patience to others that I wished someone had extended to us, before matters grew so severe that a ballroom and a public demand became the only solution left." He said nothing for a moment, simply studying her with an intensity that made her look down at her tea rather than hold his gaze too long. "I am beginning to think," he finally said, "that marrying you was the wisest decision I have made in years, even if I arrived at it through considerably less wisdom than I would like to admit." It was the closest thing to open affection he had offered her since the wedding, and Cassandra found herself smiling despite her efforts to remain composed, a small, private warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with debts or settlements or the complicated circumstances that had first bound them together. When Mr. Pratt finally returned, his expression was grave enough that Cassandra knew before he spoke that whatever he had found confirmed her worst suspicions. "Your Grace, the original debt your father owed the Ashbourne estate was closer to £4,000, not 11, he said, spreading several documents across the small table between them. "The additional 7,000 appears to have been added through a series of forged notes, all bearing the signature of the late Duke, your husband's father, dated in the final months of his life, when by all accounts he was too ill to conduct any business whatsoever. I believe the notes were created by someone with intimate access to the estate's paperwork, someone who understood exactly how to make fraudulent debt appear legitimate." "Mr. Pelham," Cassandra said quietly, "I cannot prove it conclusively without further investigation, but the handwriting bears a notable resemblance to samples I obtained of his correspondence. It would explain a great deal, Your Grace. A steward who inflates a debt owed to his employer by £7,000 could easily arrange to redirect a portion of that sum into his own accounts once collected, particularly if the collection took the unusual form of an entire marriage settlement, rather than a simple cash payment that might draw closer scrutiny." Cassandra sat back in her chair, the full weight of the revelation settling over her slowly. Her father's original sin had been real, but smaller than the catastrophe it had become. Her forced marriage, the public humiliation in the ballroom, the desperate scramble to save her family from ruin, all of it had been magnified far beyond its true proportions by a man who stood to profit from the exaggeration. And Beatrice's forged letter, appearing so conveniently timed and so carefully crafted, suddenly made a different kind of sense as well. "Do you believe Mr. Pelham forged the letter Lady Beatrice presented at the wedding as well?" she asked. "It would not surprise me in the slightest, Your Grace. A man skilled enough to forge a duke's signature would find a young lady's handwriting a considerably simpler task. Whether he acted alone or in cooperation with Lady Beatrice, I cannot say with certainty. But the timing and the skill required point toward the same source." Cassandra thanked Mr. Pratt and asked him to continue gathering evidence quietly, without alerting anyone at Ashbourne House to the investigation, while she considered how best to proceed. She spent the carriage ride home turning the revelation over in her mind, weighing the satisfaction of exposing Pelham's fraud immediately against the deeper question the discovery had raised, one that troubled her more than she wanted to admit. If the debt had been so easily manipulated, if her father's true failing had been mismanagement, rather than the catastrophic ruin the Duke had accused him of, then the entire foundation of her marriage rested on a lie she had not created and could not have prevented. She did not yet know how to feel about that, whether it changed anything meaningful between herself and the man she had married, or whether the connection they had begun building over the past weeks stood entirely apart from the circumstances that had first brought them together. She found the Duke that evening in his study, reviewing correspondence by lamplight, and she watched him for a moment from the doorway before announcing herself, studying the familiar furrow of concentration between his brows, the way his fingers absently turned his pen when he paused to consider a difficult letter. Whatever she decided to do with what she had learned, she realized, would irrevocably shape whatever remained of the fragile trust growing between them. "I need to speak with you about something serious," she said, stepping into the room. He looked up immediately, setting down his pen, something in her tone clearly signaling that this was not an ordinary evening conversation. "What is it?" Cassandra sat across from him and laid out everything Mr. Pratt had discovered, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something colder and more focused as the full picture assembled itself before him. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands pressed flat against the desk, as though bracing himself against the weight of the revelation. £7,000, he finally said, his voice low. "My father was dying, Cassandra. He could barely hold a pen in his final weeks, let alone conduct business. I trusted Pelham to manage everything during that time because I was too consumed with grief and the burden of the title to attend to it myself. And he used that trust to manufacture a debt that destroyed your family's reputation and forced you into a marriage you never wanted." "I did not say I never wanted it," Cassandra said quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Not anymore, at least. Whatever else is true, I do not regret where we have arrived, even if the path here was built on something false." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded crossing his features before he composed himself again. "You are remarkably generous, considering the circumstances." "I am practical," she corrected. "Anger at the lie does not undo the last month, and I find I have grown rather fond of the version of my life that exists now, dishonest foundation or not. What concerns me more is what we do next. Pelham has already proven himself capable of forgery and deceit on a significant scale. If he believes his fraud is close to being discovered, there is no telling what he might attempt to protect himself." The Duke rose from his desk, pacing the length of the study with barely contained fury, though Cassandra could see him working to master it, to turn raw anger into something more useful and deliberate. "I will not confront him carelessly," he said finally. "Not until we have gathered enough evidence to ensure he cannot simply disappear before facing consequences for what he has done. But I want you involved in every step of this, Cassandra. You uncovered what I should have noticed myself months ago. I will not shut you out of resolving it now." Something warm and unfamiliar settled in Cassandra's chest at his words, a feeling she did not immediately recognize because she had so rarely experienced it within the walls of her own home, even before her family's fortunes collapsed. It was the feeling of being trusted, of being treated as a genuine partner rather than an obligation to be managed or a debt to be settled. She thought of the conditions she had demanded before agreeing to marry him, the voice in the household she had insisted upon, and realized, with quiet satisfaction, that he was finally, fully honoring them. They spent the next hour mapping out a careful plan, deciding that Mr. Pratt would continue quietly gathering documentation while Lady Margaret, unaware of the true purpose behind the request, would be asked to review recent household expenditures, a task that would allow Pelham's handling of the estate accounts to come under closer scrutiny without raising his suspicion. Cassandra suggested they also request copies of correspondence sent to tenant farmers over the past year, reasoning that a man bold enough to forge a dying duke's signature might have grown careless in smaller matters as well, leaving a trail of inconsistencies easier to trace than the original fraud itself. "You think like a solicitor," the Duke observed, watching her sketch out the plan with quick, decisive strokes of her pen. "I think like someone who spent 2 years watching her own father's finances collapse without understanding why, until it was far too late to prevent the damage," Cassandra replied. "I do not intend to make the same mistake twice, in this household or any other I am responsible for." He reached across the desk then, an unexpected gesture, and covered her hand briefly with his own. "We are responsible for it together now," he said quietly. "I would like you to remember that, whatever we discover about Pelham, and whatever it costs us to expose him properly." Cassandra let his hand remain over hers for a moment longer than strict propriety demanded, feeling the warmth of the small gesture settle something restless inside her that had been unsettled since the night of the ball. Whatever fear had first brought them together, whatever fraud had shaped the earliest days of their marriage, she found herself increasingly certain that the partnership growing between them now was built on considerably steadier ground. "Then we begin tomorrow," she said, carefully, and together. Outside, the evening had deepened into full darkness, and somewhere in the house, Pelham continued about his business, entirely unaware that the two people he had wronged most severely were no longer separated by suspicion and cold obligation, but were instead, for the first time since the ballroom, standing firmly on the same side. The evidence against Mr. Pelham accumulated steadily over the following weeks, each new document adding another thread to a picture that grew more damning with every discovery. Lady Margaret's review of household expenditures uncovered 3 separate instances where funds had been redirected through accounts that did not correspond to any legitimate estate expense. Mr. Pratt located a former clerk who had once worked alongside Pelham and who, after some persuasion, admitted to witnessing him practice forging signatures on scraps of paper he later burned in the office fireplace. Cassandra and the Duke reviewed each new piece of evidence together in the evenings, their partnership deepening with every conversation, until the study had become something of a shared space between them, filled with quiet discussion and the occasional burst of frustrated laughter when the absurdity of Pelham's carelessness became too obvious to ignore. It was during one such evening, as they organized the final collection of documents into a coherent case, that a servant arrived with an urgent message that changed the careful pace of their investigation entirely. Before that message arrived, however, Cassandra had made a private visit to her father, unable to carry the growing weight of what she had learned without sharing at least part of it with him. She found him in his study, still smaller and grayer than the man she remembered from before their fortunes collapsed, and she told him carefully, gently, that the debt he had spent 2 years believing was entirely his own failure had been inflated far beyond its true size by a man he had trusted to manage his affairs honestly. Lord Whitmore listened in silence, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and when she finished, he let out a long, unsteady breath that seemed to release something he had been holding for a very long time. "I have spent 2 years believing myself the sole author of my family's ruin," he said quietly. "It does not undo what I did, Cassandra. I still borrowed recklessly. I still gambled with your futures without your knowledge or consent. But knowing the full weight of it was not entirely of my own making. That eases something in me I did not expect to feel eased." "You still have amends to make, Father," Cassandra said, neither absolving him fully nor withholding the small comfort of the truth. "But I did not want you to carry a burden heavier than the one that truly belongs to you." He reached for her hand then, the first genuine gesture of affection he had offered her since before the scandal began. "Whatever else has happened, you have become a woman far stronger than I ever gave you credit for being. I am sorry it took nearly losing everything for me to see it clearly." Cassandra carried the quiet warmth of that conversation with her back to Ashbourne House, though it was interrupted only hours later by the urgent message that Lady Beatrice Fenwick had requested an audience with the Duke, claiming she possessed information vital to his household that could not wait until morning. "She knows," Cassandra said immediately, setting down the papers she had been reviewing. "She would not come here otherwise, not after the wedding." The Duke's expression hardened. "Then we should hear what she has to say, and see whether her desperation makes her careless enough to confirm what we already suspect." Beatrice arrived within the hour, ushered into the study with visible reluctance, her usual poise noticeably strained around the edges. She glanced between Cassandra and the Duke, clearly unsettled by the sight of them seated together, working through documents that she could not have known the significance of but which seemed, from her expression, to trouble her regardless. "I have come to warn you," she said, addressing the Duke directly, deliberately avoiding Cassandra's gaze. "Your steward, Mr. Pelham, is not the man you believe him to be. I have reason to think he has been deceiving you, regarding matters far more serious than household accounts." "How fascinating," the Duke said, his tone carrying an edge of cold amusement that made Beatrice's composure falter further. "And how convenient that you arrive with this warning only after your own scheme at my wedding collapsed so thoroughly. Tell me, Lady Beatrice, did Mr. Pelham provide you with that forged letter, or did you commission it from him yourself?" The color drained from Beatrice's face, confirming the truth more effectively than any admission could have. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally sank into the nearest chair, as though her legs could no longer support the weight of the accusation. "He approached me," she said quietly, all pretense of composure abandoned now, "weeks before the wedding. He told me he could provide proof that Miss Whitmore had orchestrated the entire scandal at the ball deliberately, that she had manipulated you into the marriage for her family's financial benefit. I wanted to believe it because I had hoped, for a very long time, that you might one day consider me instead. When he offered me a way to expose her as a fraud before the wedding could take place, I did not question his methods closely enough. Why would he want to prevent our marriage? The Duke asked, leaning forward with sharpened attention. What did he stand to gain from destroying it? Beatrice shook her head, genuine confusion crossing her features. I do not know. He never explained his reasons, only offered the letter and assured me it would accomplish exactly what I wanted. I did not think to ask why a household steward would concern himself with the outcome of his employer's marriage. Cassandra exchanged a glance with the Duke, and she could see the same realization dawning in his expression that had already formed in her own mind. If the marriage had been prevented, if Beatrice's scheme had succeeded in publicly humiliating Cassandra before the vows were spoken, the settlement absorbing her father's debt would never have been finalized. The £11,000, inflated far beyond its true value through Pelham's forgeries, would have remained an active, unresolved debt, one that Pelham himself could have continued manipulating for years to come, skimming whatever portion he pleased from ongoing collection efforts rather than settling the matter cleanly through a single marriage contract that placed everything under close scrutiny. He wanted the debt to remain unresolved, Cassandra said slowly. As long as my father owed an active debt to this estate, Pelham could continue inflating it, continue redirecting portions of it for his own benefit. Our marriage threatened to close that opportunity permanently, which is precisely why he needed the wedding to fail. And I very nearly gave him exactly what he wanted, Beatrice said, her voice small with the weight of the realization. I am sorry, Cassandra. I let my own jealousy blind me to being used as thoroughly as your father was. It was the first time Beatrice had used her given name, the first genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing Cassandra had heard from her since the ballroom, and despite everything, Cassandra found she could not summon the satisfaction of anger she might once have expected to feel. There was only a tired sort of understanding, the recognition that Beatrice, too, had been a piece moved carelessly across a board by a man far more calculating than either of them had realized. Thank you for telling us the truth now, even if it comes later than it should have, Cassandra said. But you understand this cannot simply be forgotten. Pelham must answer for what he has done, and your role in his scheme, however unwitting, will need to be part of that reckoning. Beatrice nodded, resigned. I expected as much. I will testify to whatever is needed, if it helps to expose him properly. It is the least I can do, given how badly I misjudged the situation. After Beatrice departed, the Duke sat in silence for several minutes, processing the full scope of what had been revealed. We have enough now, he finally said. Enough evidence, enough testimony, to confront him directly, and ensure he cannot simply vanish before facing consequences. I want to do it tomorrow morning, before he has any further opportunity to cover his tracks. Cassandra nodded, though a flicker of unease passed through her at the thought of the confrontation ahead. He will not simply confess and accept whatever punishment we decide. A man who has spent this long, constructing an elaborate fraud, will not surrender easily once cornered. No, the Duke agreed. He will not, which is precisely why I want you present when we confront him, Cassandra. He forged your handwriting, manipulated your family's reputation, and nearly destroyed our marriage before it began. You deserve to see this resolved, not simply hear about it secondhand after the fact. The following morning arrived with a tension that reminded Cassandra unsettlingly of the night in the ballroom, the same electric anticipation of confrontation hanging heavy in the air, as she and the Duke made their way to the estate office, where Pelham conducted his daily business. He looked up as they entered together, and something in his expression shifted immediately, some instinct warning him that this was not an ordinary visit. Your Grace, he said, rising from his desk with careful, deliberate politeness. I was not expecting you and the Duchess together this morning. Is there some matter I can assist with? Several matters, actually, the Duke said, closing the door behind them with quiet finality. We have spent the past weeks reviewing the estate's accounts in considerable detail, Pelham. Beginning with the original debt attributed to Lord Whitmore, and continuing through a rather extensive pattern of redirected funds that stretches back nearly 2 years. Pelham's composure held for a moment longer, but Cassandra watched the calculation flicker behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of how much they truly knew, and how best to salvage the situation. I am not certain what you are suggesting, Your Grace, but I assure you every entry in those accounts can be explained. Can they? Cassandra asked, stepping forward. Including the £7,000 added to my father's debt through notes forged with the signature of a dying man too ill to hold a pen. Including the letter presented at our wedding, written in an imitation of my own handwriting, which you provided to Lady Beatrice Fenwick in the hope of preventing our marriage from proceeding at all? The last remaining fragment of Pelham's composure crumbled visibly. He glanced toward the door, a brief instinctive movement that betrayed the impulse to flee, before it was quickly suppressed by the recognition that escape was no longer a realistic possibility. "You cannot prove any of this," he said, though his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "We can," the Duke said flatly. "A former clerk who witnessed you practicing forgeries, a trail of financial irregularities that Lady Margaret has documented in exhaustive detail, and Lady Beatrice herself, who has already confirmed your role in orchestrating the letter presented at my wedding. You have very little left to stand on, Pelham, and considerably less time than you might imagine to decide how you wish to face what comes next." For a long, tense moment, Pelham said nothing, his eyes darting between them as though searching for some remaining avenue of escape or negotiation. Finally, his shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him as the full weight of exposure settled over his features. "I did what I did because your father, the late Duke, promised me a share of the estate's income for my years of loyal service, a promise he never honored in writing before his death," he said bitterly. "I told myself I was simply collecting what I was owed, a little at a time, in ways no one would notice. It became easier to justify with each small theft, until the amounts grew larger than I ever intended. That does not excuse destroying my father's reputation," Cassandra said, "or nearly ruining my sister's future, or manipulating a woman's jealousy into an attempt to publicly humiliate me in front of half the city." Pelham had no answer for that, and none was truly expected. The Duke summoned the household guards waiting just outside the door, and Pelham was escorted from the estate under close supervision, to be handed over to the proper authorities before the day's end, the full extent of his fraud to be presented as evidence in whatever legal proceedings followed. When the office had emptied and the immediate tension of the confrontation finally eased, Cassandra found herself trembling slightly with the release of weeks of accumulated strain. The Duke noticed, and without hesitation, drew her into a careful embrace, the first genuine gesture of comfort he had offered her since the difficult early days of their marriage. "It is finished," he said quietly against her hair. "Whatever began that night in the ballroom, whatever lies shaped the earliest days of our marriage, it ends here, today, with the truth finally standing where deception used to be." Cassandra allowed herself to lean into him fully, feeling the last of her tension slowly ease. "Not entirely finished," she said. "There is still Beatrice's public testimony to arrange, still the matter of clearing my father's name properly before the city that watched him humiliated. But I believe for the first time since that night, that we are facing what remains together, rather than as strangers bound only by circumstance." Lady Margaret joined them later that afternoon, having heard from the household staff that Pelham had been removed under guard, and her relief at the news was tempered by a lingering unease that she voiced plainly once they were all seated together in the drawing room. "I trusted that man with the running of this household for nearly 6 years, she said, shaking her head slowly. "I signed papers he prepared without a second thought. I recommended him to friends managing their own estates. I wonder now how many other households he may have touched with the same quiet dishonesty he practiced here." "Mr. Pratt has already begun making discreet inquiries among the solicitors he knows," Cassandra said. "If Pelham has done this elsewhere, we will find evidence of it eventually. For now, I think we owe ourselves a measure of relief that it ended here before it could grow any larger." The Duke moved to the window, looking out over the darkening gardens with an expression Cassandra had come to recognize over the past weeks, the particular stillness he wore when turning something over carefully in his mind before speaking it aloud. "There remains the matter of clearing Lord Whitmore's reputation properly," he said. "The city watched him humiliated over a debt that was never truly his to bear in full. I do not intend to let that falsehood stand uncorrected, simply because the immediate danger has passed." "How do you propose to correct it?" Lady Margaret asked. "Publicly," the Duke said, turning back to face them, "in a manner that leaves no room for whispered doubt afterward. I have an idea, though it will require careful timing, and I suspect it will not be without its own difficulties." Cassandra watched him with growing curiosity, sensing the shape of something significant forming behind his measured words, though he offered no further details that evening, promising only that he would share the full plan once he had considered every angle of how it might unfold. She did not press him further, trusting, for the first time without hesitation, that whatever he intended would be carried out with the same fierce, deliberate care he had shown throughout the entire reckoning with Pelham's deceit. Together, the Duke agreed, and for the first time, the word carried none of the coldness or obligation it once had. It simply sounded, quietly and completely, like the truth. The invitations went out a week later, addressed to nearly every family who had attended the wedding, and to several who had merely heard about it secondhand and spread the resulting gossip through the city with particular enthusiasm. The Duke had chosen the same ballroom where the entire ordeal began, insisting that whatever needed correcting should be corrected in the exact place where the damage had first been done. Cassandra had questioned the wisdom of returning to that room at all, uncertain whether reopening old wounds would truly serve the purpose he intended, but the Duke had been resolute. "The city watched me humiliate your father and demand your submission in that room," he told her. "It is only right that the same room witness the truth being restored, and witness precisely how wrong I was to ever demand it in the first place." The evening of the gathering arrived with a tension that reminded Cassandra sharply of the wedding, though this time the uncertainty she felt carried a different quality entirely, less fear and more anticipation for what her husband intended to reveal. She dressed carefully, choosing a deep burgundy gown that Lady Margaret had helped select, one that made her feel, for the first time since the scandal began, entirely in command of her own presence, rather than a woman waiting to be judged by whoever watched her enter a room. The ballroom filled quickly, curiosity drawing guests who remembered the scandal vividly and wondered aloud to one another what fresh drama the evening might hold. Cassandra caught snatches of speculation as she moved through the crowd on the Duke's arm, guesses ranging from an announcement of an expected heir to rumors of some further scandal involving Lady Beatrice, whose absence from the gathering had already been noted with interest. At the appointed hour, the Duke released Cassandra's arm and stepped forward alone, positioning himself at the center of the room, precisely where he had once stood delivering his cruel demand months earlier. The musicians fell silent at a signal from Lady Margaret, and gradually the entire assembly turned their attention toward him, the same electric hush settling over the room that Cassandra remembered from the night everything had begun. "Many of you were present in this very room several months ago," the Duke began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom, "when I publicly demanded that Miss Cassandra Whitmore, now my wife, kneel before me over a debt I claimed her father owed to my estate. I stand before you tonight to correct that moment fully, because everything I said and did that evening was built upon a foundation of fraud I did not understand until recently." A murmur rippled through the crowd, guests exchanging glances of surprise and undisguised curiosity. The Duke continued, undeterred, his gaze sweeping the room with the same commanding presence he had once used to humiliate rather than to heal. "The debt I described that night as £11,000 was, in truth, closer to 4,000, a sum Lord Whitmore had genuinely borrowed and genuinely intended to repay, however slowly circumstances allowed. The remaining 7,000 was manufactured through forged documents created by my own household steward, Mr. Pelham, who exploited my father's final illness to fabricate debts that never existed, skimming the difference for his own benefit over the course of nearly 2 years." Cassandra watched her father's face from where he stood near the edge of the crowd, saw the mixture of shame and relief and disbelief crossing his features as the truth was finally spoken aloud, publicly, by the very man who had once demanded his humiliation. Louisa stood beside him, gripping his arm tightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Pelham has been handed over to the proper authorities, and evidence of his fraud will be presented in full during whatever legal proceedings follow," the Duke continued. "But I owe a separate and more personal correction to this room, and to one person in particular." He turned then, fully, to face Cassandra directly, and something in the shift of his posture told the entire assembly that whatever came next carried weight far beyond the simple correction of a financial record. Cassandra felt her heart quicken, uncertain what he intended, though she trusted him now in a way she could not have imagined possible on the night he had first spoken to her in this very room. "I demanded that you kneel before me," he said, his voice softening even as it continued to carry across the silent ballroom, "as though your family's misfortune made you somehow beneath the respect owed to any person, let alone a woman of your evident intelligence and courage. I was wrong to demand it then, and I have thought of little else since the moment you refused." To the astonishment of every guest present, the Duke of Ashbourne slowly lowered himself to one knee in the center of the ballroom, in front of the entire assembled city, in the exact spot where he had once issued his cruel demand. "I ask your forgiveness, Cassandra, not simply for the falsehood of the debt, but for every moment I treated you as an obligation to be managed, rather than a woman deserving of genuine respect and partnership. You have proven yourself wiser, braver, and more capable than I deserved in a wife, and I would spend the remainder of my life earning the trust you have shown me, despite every reason I gave you to withhold it." The ballroom remained utterly silent, 300 guests holding their breath as they watched the most powerful man in the city kneel before the woman he had once ordered to submit to him. Cassandra felt tears gathering that she refused to let fall, felt the weight of every difficult moment since that first terrible night settling into something that finally, at last, felt like resolution rather than survival. She stepped forward and extended her hand to him, not to raise him from his knee out of obligation, but because she wanted the gesture to be hers to offer rather than his to demand. "I forgive you," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet register. "Not because you knelt before me tonight, but because you have spent every day since the wedding proving, through action rather than words alone, that the man who spoke so cruelly that first night was not the whole of who you truly are. I do not need you kneeling before me, Alexander. I only ever needed you standing beside me." He rose slowly, taking her extended hand and pressing it gently to his lips, and the ballroom erupted into applause that felt, this time, entirely unlike the polite obligatory sound of the wedding breakfast months earlier. It felt genuine, moved, as though the assembled guests had witnessed something rare and true rather than a mere social performance. Lord Whitmore approached them once the applause began to settle, his eyes still bright with unshed tears, and the Duke turned to him with unexpected warmth. "Lord Whitmore, I owe you an apology as well, one considerably overdue. I judged you harshly for a debt inflated far beyond what you actually owed, and I demanded your daughter's future as payment for a crime that was never fully yours to answer for. I hope, in time, you will allow me to make proper amends, beginning with a formal correction of the record regarding your original obligation." "You have already done more than I could have asked, Your Grace," Lord Whitmore said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have restored my daughter's dignity in front of the very people who watched it stripped away. That is a debt I could never fully repay, whatever remains of the original sum." As the evening continued, guests approached Cassandra in a steady stream, offering congratulations and apologies in equal measure, many admitting openly that they had believed the worst of her during the early weeks of gossip, and were grateful now to see the truth so thoroughly and publicly corrected. Beatrice arrived later in the evening, hesitant and visibly nervous, and approached Cassandra directly rather than waiting to be sought out. "I did not expect to be welcome here tonight," she admitted quietly. "But I wanted to see this for myself, and to say again, properly, how deeply sorry I am for the part I played in nearly destroying what has clearly become something genuine between you." "You are welcome here, Beatrice," Cassandra said, and found she meant it fully. "We were both, in different ways, pieces moved by a man far more calculating than either of us realized in time. I would rather build something better from what remains than continue carrying anger toward someone who has already paid enough in humiliation of her own tonight." Beatrice's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she pressed Cassandra's hand briefly before moving away to rejoin the wider gathering, leaving behind a quiet sense of closure that Cassandra had not expected to feel so completely. Henry Colton found Cassandra shortly after Beatrice departed, a wide grin spreading across his face as he offered her a glass of champagne much as he had done at her wedding months earlier. "I believe I owe you an apology for ever doubting how this arrangement would end," he said. "I confess I told several friends after the wedding that I gave the marriage 6 months before it collapsed entirely into cold civility. I am pleased, and considerably poorer for having wagered against you. To admit I was entirely wrong." "You wagered on my marriage?" Cassandra asked, raising an eyebrow with amusement rather than offense. "Half the city did, in one form or another," Henry admitted cheerfully, "though I suspect most of those wagers have now been quietly forgotten, given the spectacle we all just witnessed. I do not believe anyone present tonight will forget it easily." Lady Margaret joined them soon after, her expression carrying a warmth Cassandra had not seen from her since the earliest days of the wedding preparations. "I have known my nephew his entire life," she said, watching the Duke across the room as he spoke quietly with Lord Whitmore. "I have never once seen him kneel to anyone, not even his own father in the man's final, most demanding years. Whatever else this ordeal has cost this family, I believe it has given my nephew something considerably more valuable than the money Pelham stole. It has given him a wife capable of teaching him humility without ever diminishing his strength." "He taught himself that lesson," Cassandra said. "I merely refused to let him avoid it." "Perhaps," Lady Margaret said, smiling faintly, "though I suspect very few women could have accomplished it quite so thoroughly, or quite so gracefully, as you have managed tonight." As the crowd continued to thin, Cassandra found a quiet moment to speak with Louisa, who had spent much of the evening watching the proceedings with wide, fascinated eyes, clearly absorbing every detail of a night that would likely shape her own understanding of marriage and courtship for years to come. "Are you still frightened of what marriage might mean for your own future, after everything you witnessed tonight?" Cassandra asked gently. "I do not think I am frightened at all anymore," Louisa said, surprising her sister with the certainty in her voice. "I used to believe marriage meant simply accepting whatever arrangement was offered, the way Father once nearly forced upon you. Tonight I watched you demand better than that, and receive it in the end. I think, whatever happens in my own future, I will remember that lesson above every other one I might have learned this season." Cassandra embraced her sister warmly, grateful beyond words that whatever pain the scandal had caused, it had at least left Louisa with a clearer, steadier understanding of her own worth than Cassandra herself had possessed before the ordeal began. The trust fund Mr. Pratt had secured months earlier remained untouched and fully protected, ensuring that whatever path Louisa eventually chose for her own future, she would choose it from a position of genuine security rather than desperate necessity. Later, as the evening wound toward its close and the guests began their slow departure into the cool night air, Cassandra found herself standing near the same tall windows where she had once hoped to disappear into the shadows on the night everything began. The Duke joined her there, offering his arm not out of obligation but out of simple, genuine companionship. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked quietly, watching the last of the guests filter toward their waiting carriages. "The debt, the marriage, the demand I made that started this entire ordeal?" Cassandra considered the question seriously before answering, thinking of the fear and humiliation of that first night, the careful negotiations that followed, the slow, unexpected building of trust and partnership that had transformed a forced arrangement into something she genuinely valued. "I regret that it began with cruelty," she said finally, "but I do not regret where it has led us. I do not think I would trade this version of my life, difficult as its beginning was, for any other path that might have avoided it." "Neither would I," the Duke said, drawing her closer as the last candles in the ballroom began to gutter low. "Whatever else I have learned from this ordeal, I have learned that the woman who refused to kneel before me was never beneath my respect. She was simply waiting for me to become worthy of standing beside her instead." Before they departed the ballroom themselves, the Duke paused near the doors and looked back over the emptying room, the same room where his cruelty had first ignited the entire ordeal, and where his humility had now brought it to a close. "I intend to make one final change before we leave this chapter fully behind us," he said. "I want the settlement papers amended, formally, to strike out every reference to a debt owed. What remains between our families should be recorded as nothing more than what it has become, a marriage entered freely, and continued by choice rather than obligation." "You do not need to rewrite the papers for that to be true," Cassandra said. "I have known it for some time now, quietly, without needing the ink to confirm it." "Perhaps," he said, offering her his arm as they stepped toward the doors together. "But I find I want the record to reflect it plainly, for anyone who might someday wonder how this marriage truly began, and how little that beginning ultimately mattered against everything that followed." They walked out into the cool night air together, leaving behind a ballroom transformed entirely from the place of humiliation it had once been, into something that guests would speak of for years afterward, not as the site of Cassandra Whitmore's disgrace, but as the place where a duke had knelt before his wife, and finally understood the difference between demanding respect and earning it. Outside, the city settled slowly into night. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy an entire family finally resolved into something neither Cassandra nor the Duke could have predicted the evening he first walked into that ballroom demanding submission. What remained now was not debt nor obligation, nor the cold arithmetic of settlements and forced arrangements, but something far rarer and far more valuable, a partnership built, in the end, on equal ground. 6 months after the ballroom gathering that had set the entire city talking anew, Cassandra stood in the gardens of Ashbourne House, watching workmen carry the final crates of books into a small stone building that had once served as an unused summer house. Alexander had surprised her with the project weeks earlier, converting the neglected structure into a proper library and study of her own, separate from the grand formal library inside the main house, a space where she could work on the growing list of tenant matters and household accounts she had taken an increasing interest in managing alongside him. "You did not need to build me an entire building," she said, watching him direct the final placement of a heavy oak desk near the window. "The library inside the house would have suited perfectly well." "The library inside the house suits me," Alexander said, brushing dust from his sleeve as he crossed the room to join her. "I wanted you to have something entirely your own, a place that belonged to you, before it belonged to the estate or to me. You have spent your whole life making space for other people's needs, Cassandra. I thought it was time you had a space built specifically around yours." The gesture moved her more than she expected, and she found herself surveying the room with fresh appreciation, noting the careful details he had clearly considered without her knowledge, the specific shade of blue in the curtains that matched a dress she had once mentioned admiring, the low, comfortable chair positioned near the fireplace exactly where morning light would fall most pleasantly across its cushions. Their partnership had only deepened in the months since Pelham's exposure, settling into rhythms neither of them could have predicted on the night of their forced engagement. Alexander consulted her regularly on estate matters now, not merely as a courtesy but as genuine necessity, having come to rely on her careful judgment in ways that had surprised even Lady Margaret, who had once doubted whether any young bride could earn such thorough trust so quickly. Lord Whitmore's reputation, meanwhile, had been fully restored within the city, the public correction at the ballroom gathering proving more than sufficient to silence whatever lingering whispers had once followed the family through every social gathering. He had taken to visiting Ashbourne House regularly now, no longer the shamed, diminished figure Cassandra remembered from the darkest weeks of the scandal, but a man slowly rebuilding both his finances and his dignity, with a steadiness that pleased her deeply. Louisa, meanwhile, had begun her own first proper season, under far different circumstances than Cassandra's had unfolded, entering ballrooms not as the sister of a scandal, but as the sister of a duchess whose story had become, in its own strange way, something the city now regarded with genuine admiration rather than pity. The matter of Pelham's fraud had concluded in the courts several months earlier, the former steward sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment once the full extent of his deception, spanning several other households beyond Ashbourne itself, came fully to light through the careful inquiries Mr. Pratt had continued pursuing. 2 other families, it turned out, had suffered similar manipulations under his management, and the resolution of Cassandra's own case had given them the confidence and the evidence needed to pursue their own claims successfully. Lady Beatrice Fenwick had left the city entirely for a time, staying with distant relatives in the countryside to allow the worst of the gossip surrounding her role in the scheme to fade before her eventual return. She had written to Cassandra twice since departing, brief, careful letters that spoke honestly of her regret and her slow efforts to rebuild a version of herself less consumed by jealousy and competition. Cassandra had responded warmly both times, finding that whatever resentment she might once have carried toward the other woman had genuinely faded into something closer to cautious goodwill. Lady Margaret, too, had settled into a role within the household that suited her far better than the brisk, appraising figure Cassandra had first encountered on the day of the engagement announcement. She had taken to spending her afternoons in the gardens with Cassandra, discussing everything from tenant welfare to the newest novels arriving from the city booksellers, and more than once she had remarked, with evident satisfaction, that Ashbourne House felt warmer and more genuinely alive than it had in all the years since Alexander's father had first fallen ill. The formality that once governed every interaction within its walls had softened considerably, replaced by something closer to the easy comfort of a family that had chosen one another rather than simply inherited its arrangement through circumstance. Louisa's own season had brought its own quiet surprises as well. She had grown close to a thoughtful young gentleman named Edmund Caro, the second son of a modest but respected family, a man who showed none of the calculating coldness that had once shaped Cassandra's own introduction to marriage. Cassandra watched their courtship unfold with careful attention, offering her sister guidance whenever it was asked for, and holding her tongue whenever it was not, determined that Louisa should shape her own path toward marriage without the shadow of fear or desperation that had once colored Cassandra's earliest decisions. When Edmund finally called on their father to request permission for a formal courtship, Louisa had run immediately to Ashbourne House to share the news, breathless with an excitement entirely unclouded by the anxieties that had once defined the family's circumstances. "He asked me first," Louisa said, practically glowing as she recounted the conversation. "Before he ever spoke to father, he asked whether I wanted him to. I told him I would not accept a courtship built any other way, not after everything I watched you insist upon for yourself." Cassandra embraced her sister warmly, feeling a quiet, private satisfaction settle over her at the realization that her own refusal in that ballroom so many months earlier had rippled outward in ways she could not have predicted, shaping not only her own marriage but her sister's expectations of what a marriage should rightfully look like as well. On a quiet evening in early autumn, Cassandra sat with Alexander in her new study, reviewing correspondence together as the fire crackled softly beside them, when he set down the letter he had been reading, and studied her for a long moment with an expression she had come to recognize as the particular stillness that preceded something important. "I have been thinking about that first night," he said, "about everything I said to you in that ballroom, and everything that followed because of it. I find I owe you a debt of my own now, one considerably harder to settle than money." "You have already settled it," Cassandra said, setting aside her own letters to give him her full attention, "in front of the entire city, on your knee, in that very ballroom." "That settled the public account," he agreed. "But there is a private one that remains, and I find I want to address it properly, without an audience this time, without any grand gesture beyond simple honesty." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand in his. I did not marry you because I chose to, at first. I married you because circumstances demanded it, and I told myself for weeks afterward that any warmth growing between us was simply the natural result of proximity, nothing more significant than familiarity mistaken for something deeper. I no longer believe that, Cassandra. I have come to love you, not out of obligation or circumstance, but entirely and deliberately, for exactly the woman you have proven yourself to be at every turn since that first terrible night. Cassandra felt her breath catch, the words landing with a weight she had not fully anticipated despite the months of growing closeness between them. I did not expect to hear that so plainly, she admitted, though I confess I have wondered, more than once, whether you felt it as clearly as I have come to feel it myself. And what have you come to feel? He asked quietly. That I no longer think of this marriage as something I survived, she said. I think of it as something I chose, again and again, in every small decision since the wedding, until choosing you stopped feeling like an act of survival, and became instead simply the truth of what I wanted. I love you as well, Alexander. Not the man who demanded I kneel in that ballroom, but the man who knelt there himself months later, and every version of you I have come to know in the months between those two moments. He drew her close then, and for a long, quiet while, neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together in the warm light of the fire, the weight of everything that had brought them to this point finally settling into something that felt entirely peaceful rather than merely resolved. Later, as the evening deepened further and the household grew quiet around them, Cassandra found herself thinking back to the girl who had stood frozen in that ballroom months earlier, ordered to kneel before a stranger's fury, refusing out of nothing more than sheer, desperate pride, because it was the only thing left that felt entirely her own to protect. She could not have imagined, on that terrible night, the path that single refusal would eventually carve through her life, the fraud it would expose, the family it would ultimately heal, the unexpected partnership it would build between two people who had begun as nothing more than debt and obligation to one another. She thought, too, of every woman who might someday find herself in a similar position, forced into circumstances not of her choosing, pressured toward submission by men who mistook power for the right to demand it. She hoped, quietly, that her own story might eventually reach such women, might offer some small measure of courage to refuse what deserved refusing, to negotiate rather than simply surrender, to insist on being treated as an equal, even when every circumstance seemed determined to convince her otherwise. Outside the study windows, the autumn evening settled fully into darkness, the estate quiet and peaceful in a way it had rarely been during the chaotic months following the wedding. Cassandra remained beside her husband long into the night, no longer the overlooked daughter of a failing family, no longer a debt bride whispered about behind gloved hands, but a duchess who had built, through sheer will and unwavering dignity, a marriage genuinely worth the price it had once seemed to cost her. She had refused to kneel that first night, and in refusing, had ultimately shaped a partnership where neither of them needed to kneel at all, except by their own choice, offered freely, out of love rather than demand.